You're listening to Climate Curious, a podcast for people who care about the world but find the current conversation about climate change confusing, boring, or scary. Hello.
Welcome to our bonus episode. This is episode 9, Ben. So we've been at this for 2 and a bit months.
Yeah, that's a lot of conversation.
How are you feeling
about one topic?
I know.
I'm feeling less anxious.
That's good.
Which is good, I think. I feel like in the beginning of this, I was like super tense. And a bit worried and being quite harsh on myself. I think I was a bit I've been talking in therapy recently about inner child stuff. And I think I was pretty judgmental of myself in terms of my how disengaged I was in the conversation. So I'm feeling a lot more relaxed. I think that's a big visible change.
Oh, I love that. That's really good to hear. And I'm going to come back to that at the very, very end. But I want to ask you, let's set the scene. Let's actually go back to the summer, if we can remember what that was like. And
all the way back.
And I'll give you a call and I say to you, Ben, do you want to co-host this podcast on climate change with me?
Yeah. Give
our listeners a snapshot into what you're thinking.
Ooh, what did I think? I thought, my first thought was... am I going to get paid for it? No, I'm joking. That's not my first thought. My first thought was, I know absolutely nothing about climate change. And what I've learned over the course of my career is that when you don't know something, you should never admit to not knowing it. But I'm trying to actively practice doing the opposite. So I think my response to you was actually, I don't know. I'd love to do a podcast with you. That would be so fun, but I don't know anything about climate change at all. And you reassured me. That was really nice. You were like, no, that's the point. I felt pretty chill about having conversations, but also a little bit intimidated by the fact that I knew absolutely nothing. Sometimes people say they know nothing and they actually know a fair bit. I had no framework for understanding climate change apart from adverts that come up on YouTube.
Yeah, I was really excited that we would get to take this journey together. I had been thinking about climate change intensely for the previous 4 or 5 months, very kind of in a less intense, a less knowledgeable way before that, and knew that it was this massive blind spot for us as not just me as a person, but us as an organization. I am really excited to review this season with you and think about all the things we've learned. All right, so let's move into a bit of a retrospective. And where I want us to start is this idea of mindset. So first I want to start with our mindset. Ben, one of the things I think I appreciated so much, and you've mentioned this before, is you went into every one of these episodes willing to ask any question. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that a bit, and also, did you feel like you got the answers you wanted?
Yeah, so do you know what? I just think it's super fun. I feel like on one level, it's really fun to. So I was reading my my mum showed me my report from year 10 last weekend, and it was pretty discouraging. but so when I was in school, and all of my teachers said exactly the same thing in all of my reports across all of my subjects except for PE, where they were Ben's great. In all of the other subjects, they were Ben's really positive. He contributes really well to lessons. He asks loads of questions, but he's easily distracted and easily distracts other people. And I think I have always been the kind of person that's very inquisitive, and not particularly ashamed to ask a question, even when I know it's a dumb question, because my suspicion is if I don't know something, there's going to be at least 2 or 3 other people in the same space as me that also don't know and just wouldn't ask. But I think one of the things that I think is super important. And like, obviously climate change has never been my area of work or expertise. I work a lot in like masculinities, and diversity and inclusion and gender equality. But one of the things I always appreciate, like when I'm a guest on a podcast, is being asked to explain things that I take for granted in my understanding. Because I think it, like on one level, like it forces you to refresh your memory, like it forces you to re-understand the thing for yourself. But I also think it's just super like freeing and releasing to be able to chat generally, rather than to like, sometimes we get caught in this like trap of like explaining things like in a super academic way, or like, and I personally find it pretty boring to do that. So I feel like for the people that are coming onto the pod, like it felt like in asking those questions, it was an opportunity for them to like just have a chat about something that they're pretty passionate about. And then I guess that the byproduct of that is I felt like I did get all of the answers that I wanted. I don't feel like there was a point where I asked a question and somebody kind of avoided it. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think people were very gracious and generous with like taking their time and walking us through stuff. But it felt like all of the, so for me, I know really early on, there was an example of like, so what is the actual situation? Like, what's the actual issue here? What's the real problem? And I thought people were going to be like, oh yeah, no, and kind of talk around it. But everybody jumped straight into it and was pretty explicit about what the scope of the problem was, or the scale of the problem. So that was super cool.
Yeah, I agree. I almost found that everyone we spoke to loved the opportunity to speak about what they do day to day in a different way. And also really knew that in order for us to, make the changes we need to make, in order for us to kind of tackle this climate crisis, everyone would need to get involved. And the only way to do that is to talk to everyone. And so I felt really like that was like a big shift in the way that this is often talked about. Yeah. We got geeky, but we got geeky in a way that was accessible. So yeah. I want to play us some clips throughout this episode.
Yeah.
And so we talked about our mindset and being open, asking questions, delving into that. There's no such thing as silly or stupid questions. And I want to also now take us through, I think, a few things where different speakers, I think, helped us change our mindset when it came to the issue itself. So let's start with this clip from Charmian Love and see what you think.
Maybe it's not about the problem, but maybe you're thinking about like, how can you and those companies be part of the solution, right? So it's another way of thinking about it. So it's not just here's the problem, but actually, what is the power that I have to be part of the solution? And what is the power that others have to be a part of the solution? And then that takes me to another like both and level, which is I don't think it's either or. It's not individual or organizations and like the system. It's actually the solution to how we have to really address this climate emergency involves both and. So I think it is about the individual actions that we take. So we should be really cognizant of them and conscious of them, and do what we can. And we don't want to just assume that every individual action we take is going to save the world, because actually what we also need to do is be actively working towards a solution at a systems level. So I think that just that question you've asked, I think that's a great place to to play around with this idea of, it's not about problem. It's like problem, and the solution is on the other side. So like, how do we think about them as connected? And it's not just about an individual behavior. It's about individual and the system, and how we think about those things working together.
I think that's a really interesting way of like framing it, because I think maybe when I think about climate change, what I'm looking for is somebody to blame, rather than, which is a really weird realization actually. I think maybe I'm looking for whose fault it is rather than what the actual solution is. So maybe my mind is not so consumed. And I think that's why when we were having that conversation in the beginning about whether I care or not, like I feel like the answer is obviously I care, but at the same time, it's not really my fault, so it's somebody else's responsibility. When actually, maybe we're all supposed to be part of the solution here.
I love that. I have to say, that realization was huge for me too. Do you think that coloured the way that you saw the whole season?
Yeah, massively. Because, and I think that was so important that happened at the beginning. Because actually, that was, sometimes you have a framework for seeing a thing. when you're unaware of the fact that you see an issue through a specific lens, it's really hard for you to deconstruct your understanding of it. And for me, like that point about like fault and responsibility and blame, was so important, in terms of, again, just freeing myself from like, from playing the blame game and allowing myself to think about solutions. Like, so get into a space where you're like, okay, so now that, even being able to identify whose fault it is doesn't really matter that much. This is just the situation we're in. So now how do we get out of that? And what role do I have to play in us getting out of that? And that same question applies to everyone. Like, what role do we all have in resolving this problem? Because if we don't, like, everybody suffers the consequences, right?
Well, this is it. Because I think what you just said, Ben, links up so much to what Chris Demare said in episode 4. And so I'm actually going to play that clip, and then let's have a chat about it.
One of those aspects of wicked problems is that they often lead us to sit in our little corners and to say, no, we should wait for other people to do something first, because in the position where I am, I can't do anything.
Yeah.
And those oil barons, we've actually, in conversations that we've had with some of them or with people who work with them, they are sitting in that position. Some of them say, well, we know that climate change is a problem, but we're waiting for consumers to send the signal that we need to change.
Wow.
And others say, we know that climate change is a problem, but we don't feel that we can do much because our investors are looking over our shoulder and want us to maximize our profits. They don't want us to be thinking about climate change too much. So even those people in that context are going, but what can I do? So businesses are waiting for governments to set regulations. They're also waiting for consumers to tell them what to do. Right. Politicians are waiting for citizens to tell them what new regulations to bring in, and citizens are waiting for governments to tell them to take action and to tell them what to do. So we're all sort of just sitting there and waiting and looking, staring at each other and getting really upset for why the idiots on the other side aren't doing what they should be doing.
I think it so connects, doesn't it? If we get stuck in the blame, fault, problem camp, then you just sit around waiting for other people to be the first ones to act. And
like as a kid, I read loads of comics, right? So I always think of like life through this lens of like superheroes and supervillains and like good people and bad people. And I think what was super interesting about that part of the conversation in particular was this idea that there aren't really bad people in the way that I imagined that there were. So I always think like, oh, there's a room of people at Shell or at BP who are like sitting around and plotting and scheming of how to like kill all of us by like forcing us to use like terrible products or whatever it might be. And actually, speaking to Chris was probably the first time that I've considered those people to be people with like actual thoughts and feelings and problems to solve as well. And also had an understanding of maybe those people feeling powerless in the same way that I feel powerless to impact or change or challenge anything, or seeing an issue and thinking it's too big, and actually like all of these people are pressuring me to do all of this stuff that I don't necessarily want to do. So I think that was like a massive light bulb moment for me where I was like, oh wow, like blaming people doesn't actually really help.
There are plenty of people in the climate space who talk to who will tell you that there are some evil dudes sitting in a room making bad decisions.
Yeah, of course.
Callous decisions. But I think what was interesting there is that that's like maybe one tiny bit of this picture. Actually, most people want to do something. Most people don't want to be bad. They don't want to be evil. They're not looking to kind of harm others. Is actually a lot more of is anyone willing to actually take the first step and put their head above the parapet, right, and say actually this needs to be done. For me, it actually felt like people are scared of acting and that what we need is courage. The thing that I really loved that Chris talked about, you mentioned in that episode, Ben, how sometimes you think that people who don't agree with you are stupid, and I think that was one of my confessions. And Chris called this stupid, crazy, evil reasoning, where if someone doesn't agree with you, you either think they're stupid, they're crazy, or they must have like negative, bad, evil intention. And actually that's often not the case. I think probably this is one of the hardest things for me. It's still an ongoing battle, is not looking at someone who disagrees with me and immediately just dismissing them.
Yeah. And that but I think that's really tough across the board, isn't it? And actually, maybe that's one of the things that was like the most important reflections to come out of this whole process for me, was like, that doesn't make us abnormal. Like, I think it's pretty normal for us to judge people in that way, but also it's not necessarily conducive to resolving the problem. Or it doesn't help us to action change.
The other thing that came in terms of mindset from Chris's episode was this idea that I think is very counterintuitive and almost revolutionary, that actions drive belief. And that, if you are someone who doesn't feel strongly about an issue, who isn't already, at the point where they're willing to glue themselves to the shell building or, make massive life changes, that actually trying to change people's beliefs won't work. You need to get them to act. You need to get them to do something. The other one, the other episode that I think very much dealt with mindset was episode 6 with Clover Hogan. And there was a statistic that she shared in this episode that really floored me, right? So she talked about this research done by Friends of the Earth last year, and it showed that 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds in the UK identified as having eco-anxiety. Now, I was... That's a big number, right? I was shocked. So let's hear Clover talk about eco-anxiety a little bit.
When we think and talk about eco-anxiety, it's easy to assume that it's a bad thing, right? That it's a weakness. And yet, eco-anxiety is not a clinical condition. And in fact, many climate psychologists would argue that it's the perfectly natural human response. In fact, they would say that the problem isn't that lots of young people are feeling eco-anxiety, but that more older generations aren't. And eco-anxiety suggests a high level of empathy, and it suggests that you are not numbing yourself to the state of the world and to the problems. Obviously, we can't constantly be consumed by grief and fear and overwhelm. And yet we have to create space for those feelings, because those feelings are what catalyze us to take action. Lots of young people feel so overwhelmed by these feelings and do not have a kind of outlet of agency, a clear sense of here's what I can do. When you just have the feelings without a sense of here's what I can channel them into, that's when it tips into the powerlessness. That's when it tips into I'm too small to make a difference. Yet if you have a clear sense of here's the problem that I want to take on, kind of unattached from expectation or outcome of that problem actually being solved, that's where you really find your power. And for the older generations, often their powerlessness shows up in that kind of denial of, technology will save the day, or, young people will step up to the challenge, right? And so they need to get more in touch with their feelings. They need to create more space for that eco-anxiety and stop treating it as a weakness and start thinking of it as actually this is what's going to catalyze me to step up rather than shut down.
Super. That is... Clover's so smart, man. What the heck, first of all. But also, there is this idea, right? And like she said so much in that clip, and there's so much to like dissect. But one of the big things that stood out for me was maybe this idea of stress not being a bad thing. And like the narrative that we have as a society and as a culture is like stress is negative. And I think when you apply that to like this idea of eco-anxiety, maybe there is a case, like she's saying, for actually those of us who are older to maybe have a little bit more of that eco anxiety. And there was a point in this episode where she was talking about ecophobia, and climate denial almost being like a natural manifestation of that. And I think that's probably what a lot of us suffer from. And I know, like, at the start of this journey, that was definitely what it was for me. Do you know what I mean? Like, this idea of, like, I don't understand this thing and it's scary, so I'm just going to pretend it's not happening. As opposed to, like, maybe that her generation and what they're going through and experiencing when you can't deny something and what the impact of that is. But I feel like maybe more of us need to feel that.
True. You're listening to our emotions, that actually our brains are created in a way that they're trying to tell us something is wrong. And instead of thinking that our brains are wrong, maybe we need to think, oh, maybe this is a warning signal. This is our unconscious brain, like, designed through millions of years of evolution, warning signal that if you are feeling uncomfortable when you think about these things, then actually something is really majorly wrong. I completely agree. I also think that there's absolutely a generational divide. Not everyone, but I think I absolutely have an optimism bias. I always think something is going to come along and save the day. I have to kind of operate in that way, because otherwise it is so depressing. And so finding a way to deal with that this is another one for me, which is a work in progress. I think the next theme that really was cross-cutting was this intersectionality, right? Was this idea of equality and justice and climate change and all of these things. You know, I think for me, right in the beginning, in episode 2 and 3, you know, we were talking about air pollution and how air pollution is such a justice issue, a social justice issue, as much as it is a climate issue, as much as it is a quality of life issue and all these things, and a health issue. Because, you know, in episode 3, I thought we were going to talk about cars, and you know me, I love a good chat about cars. And we ended up talking about inequality and a just transition. So let's listen to that clip from our conversation with Monica.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you look around the world, 9 out of 10 people do not breathe clean air, period. There is no denying that. And the most vulnerable are children. And the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable are children in low-income communities. And if you go country by country, and if you look at those low-income neighborhoods, you would find many other elements to it that create the most unfair picture that you can imagine. So, for example, in California, again, the equivalent of the 10th largest economy in the world, they have mapped pollution, air pollution in particular, and they have mapped these low-income communities, and often it's basically minorities too. From the years, a lot of people who, you know, first or second or third generation immigrants, and they have less access to decision making. So when a lot of these trucks, for example, pass by neighborhoods, imagine the noise, imagine the pollution they leave behind. And now that California has also has decided to rule, to set up a rule to clean up trucks, one of the numbers that came out, I will never forget that. Basically, there are communities in California where the citizens of those communities have measured 1,200 trucks, diesel trucks, passing by every single hour. So if you think about what that does to you from a noise perspective, from your breathing perspective, from a quality of life perspective, it's not fair.
Yeah, it's not fair at all, is it? And it's like at its core, and I think this is, truly at its core, this is an equity issue, isn't it? Like it's like a deep unfairness.
Because like you said about connecting these dots, you know, it's an equity issue that becomes a health issue, which becomes a socioeconomic issue, which becomes a equity issue, which, you know, and it reinforces itself. Like if you are exposed to these these pollutants at such a massive level from childhood, then you know there's all these things about being able to concentrate in schools, about being healthy as you grow up, about being able to do, like the healthier you are, there's so much. It has so many knock-on effects. So on the 16th of December, basically there's been this inquest going on for the past, I think, year or so, in London here, about the death of a 9-year-old girl, Ella Adu Kissy Deborah, who actually David Lammy talks about in his talk as well. And so she was 9. She tragically died 7 years ago. She lived near the South Circular Road in Lewisham. So if people don't know that road, Ben, it's massive, right? It's a major, pretty busy. Cars, trucks, etc. She had a really rare acute type of asthma, and she died. And what her mum has been tirelessly fighting for 7 years is to get air pollution to be listed as a cause of death on her death certificate, which would be the first person, I think, in the world, definitely in the UK, but possibly the world, that has had this recognized as their cause of death. And it's kind of amazing, and I say that in like not a positive way. I mean, it's so sad and so close to home. I mean, I think that's the thing, Ben, right?
And the thing about this case, right, that stands out to me is like how seminal it is, like how important this ruling is, because it forces us as a society to deal with or to acknowledge the impact of what's going on. This is like life and death, right? Like people cannot exist healthily in those environments. So if that is something that's happening, and we're just constantly breathing in pollution, and like Monica said, it's the kids like who are most harshly impacted by this because of the development of their bodies, or their size and how close they are to pollution when they're walking past cars or whatever it might be. Like it moves us to a point now where we're like, this is essentially murder that's taking place in South London on a and this is one kid, right? Like this is one child, but how many people are being impacted by this? There was a link that was made in one of the episodes about the link between air pollution and asthma, and this, like as you say, amazing, not in a good way, but like amazing that somebody had the strength to fight this the whole way through and see it through to the end, because now that changes so much.
For me, when I think about this case and how close it hits to home, I don't want to be part of the problem anymore. Like, I don't think it's right that Ella's mum, has had to spend the last 7 years talking about her daughter's death every single day to bring about this kind of change.
Right. And like you say, I think we spoke about this in the episode with Monica as well, is that some of us are in a position to challenge that immediately, directly. And for those of us who are in a position to do that, for those of us who have the money to buy a new car and are planning on buying a new car in the next 5 years, like maybe we should think about what kind of car we're going to buy and take that seriously, because the link is undeniable at this point, right? Like, and again, that's something that becomes super important about, the piece of work that's been done around the death of this child is like, we can't ignore that me driving around in my car in South London has an impact on people in real time.
And so I want to move us on then to something else in this equality, justice and intersectionality piece, which we talked about in episode 5 with David Lammy, MP for Tottenham. So let me play that clip for you.
The truth is, my experience of people who are poor, people who have trouble paying the bills, people who are being harassed by the police, people who are worried about where food's coming from because they've just lost their job. And, I'm thinking of a lot of black people in that position, is they haven't got time to worry about what appears to be big picture policy, because there are a lot of daily stresses, and that's certainly the context in which I grew up. And so that's one conversation. And the other conversation is if the climate emergency is all about carbon emissions, if it's about the Green New Deal, but you never connect that to equity, to jobs that matter to people in their communities, that seem real, then of course black people aren't going to be thinking about this, which is why I did my TED Talk. One, to connect the dots, to challenge both those who are in environmental organisations, those who are raising their voice about these issues, to remind them that this in the end is not just about saving the planet, it's about the people on the planet, and the people on the planet bearing the brunt of it are black, but also to challenge the black community that if we are protesting for George Floyd, and if we are using the motif, I can't breathe, then please remember that there are thousands of people who can't breathe because they are literally being choked in their communities, or they are experiencing drought, flood, pollution in the global south. And so it's to connect the dots. It's not to exceptionalize one group. I've campaigned as a result of George Floyd's murder, but I'm not going to exceptionalize the African American experience and not say that black people that die in Darfur, which is the first climate change war, if you like, or civil war, if you like, are somehow less important. They are as important. And until we live in a world where that is fully understood, none of us are truly free.
Yeah. I think this is something that's not talked about enough. I said it in the episode, I think, but I was so excited to see that, David was giving a talk on this topic at Climate Countdown, like having race and intersectionality and the impact of climate change on black and brown people around the world center in the conversation for me is so important, because I don't think I really genuinely don't think we have thought about this. You actually asked me in this episode, Ben, when I started to think about race and climate change, and we both said it was very recently, even though, as you pointed out, neither of us is white, and so you think that maybe we would be more aware of this. I think there's a couple of things that David Lemmy says there that are really, really important to my understanding of this. One is that, and this goes back to what we talked about with the air pollution, black and brown people are disproportionately affected by climate change, and that is not just in the global south, that's everywhere, and that's not even just in air pollution and in the kind of destruction of our homes, but also in the kind of the just transition that we're going to have out of these extractive and fossil fuel and polluting industries. Right. But also that so often it's like a reinforcing disadvantage, like our post-colonial legacy and the fact that we live in that kind of a white supremacist culture means that black and brown people are disadvantaged on every level. Yeah.
And I think like when I think about myself and my own community, like my community is still catching up with the conversation about mental health. Do you know what I mean? So these kinds of conversations are not on the agenda when survival is the game. Do you know what I mean? Like there's no time to talk about this stuff. And it is, as we have seen, and I think this is what was so amazing about this conversation with David, was like sometimes I get into this space where I think all of this stuff is in my head and I can draw these links and make these points and make these comparisons, but I don't necessarily have the evidence or the facts to like back up my opinion. And just to hear someone be able to articulate what's going on and the impact of that and how badly it disproportionately affects people of colour, was just for me like a really like nourishing moment for like my spirit or my soul. I don't know how to describe it, but just like made me feel like I could rest for a moment, which is so important. And I think like the end of that clip that you just played, right, was like David making this statement, which to me is really similar to the statement injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I think that is really the core of what we're talking about here, right? Is the fact that, like, we can't, as he said, we can't exceptionalize certain things. We can't really care about one struggle of people of color in one place and not care about all of them. Or we can, but that kind of renders it useless. Do you know what I mean? Because it's not true freedom. That's not what freedom and justice and liberation actually looks like. And I think for me, like, this conversation was about the shifting of the lens of justice and liberation, and for to understand what that truly looks like climate change is a massive part of that conversation. Like,
we've talked about blame a few times here, right? Are we blaming the people who are the least contributing to the climate issue and least able to make major life changes? And I want to come to a clip from our conversation with Baroness Lola Young for this.
I'm not one of those people who believes in what I think of as eco-shaming, which is like blaming people who don't have very much money for buying cheap clothes. That's not on as far as I'm concerned. You know, the less disposable income you have, the less able you are potentially to make a difference in this sector. It's where it's corporations, it's businesses that have got to do the right thing, right? Because it's in their hands. And if they're not doing the right thing, government has to encourage them, incentivize them. And if they still don't do the right thing, then they have to be penalized. I'm no fan of disempowering people by default, which is say, well, none of us has any responsibility. I don't think that at all. But I think it depends on where you are. Look, if you're dependent on food bank, and when we talk about fast fashion, it's interesting because everybody thinks, oh, well, it's frivolous. It's the thing that girls do and some boys and blah, 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 blah. You don't have to have that. It doesn't, if you've got 2 or 3 kids and you've got to buy T-shirts for them for gym, you've got to buy a skirt for them or a pair of trousers for school. It's the garment industry. It's not just about fashion. So what are you going to do then? Are you going to say, well, I've had to go to the food bank this week, but I've got to buy the kids' school uniform from John Lewis? You know, if I want a trustworthy brand, you know, we're not. This is mad. It's cloud cuckoo land. And I think one of the things for me that I've come across with other fashion activists is this kind of attitude that says, well, it's up to the consumer to drive all of this. And I'd say, no, not really. I don't think so. I think the fashion industry has created the business model that has given us fast fashion. And also, I want to be let's be clear on this. Just because you pay a lot for something, it doesn't mean you're getting a better deal in terms of their trustworthiness around labor issues. So there are factories that somebody once famously I asked him to come to the House of Lords for a meeting about this whole area when I was first learning about it. And he brought with him a little case of T-shirts. So the one T-shirt, the cheapest one cost about £2 and was from a famous fast fashion chain. The next one was about 20 quid. The next one was about 40. And then the top one was 65 pounds.
Don't say that they were all the same.
They were all made in the same factory.
No way.
All made in the same factory. Maybe a difference between the quality of cotton, but not £63 worth.
My gosh.
I mean, you were shocked there, Ben.
Yeah, I was rattled, man. Because you know why? Because I just think like what Lola's saying here is so important about the blame piece and coming back to, again, this idea of who we point our fingers at and who we say is responsible for the situation that we're in. Because I've done that. Like, I've been the person that's like said, oh, people shouldn't be buying fast fashion and people who shop at Primark are doing something really bad and so on and so forth. Without also like taking a moment to acknowledge where I have privilege. Do you know what I mean? And I think like it's really easy for me as a black man to consider myself at the bottom of the barrel, or to consider myself in the worst position, and therefore I have the right to judge whoever I want, however harshly I want to, without acknowledging that like economic privilege is a real thing. Do you know what I mean? And actually, like, some people have no, like, it's not that people are making bad decisions. Some people have no choice to make. Like, some people have no power to make those kinds of decisions. And as the person who points the fingers, I think also, like, there's the saying, like, when you point a finger, there's 3 fingers pointing back at you.
I love that.
And I do really think, like, whenever you can see an issue, and I think this is maybe a shift for me in my thinking around this topic as well. Like, whenever you see an issue, it probably means that you're well placed to do something about the issue. Like, if you can see it and analyze it and say that's a problem because of this reason, then that's a starting point for you to make an impact or make a change. And I think that conversation is so important.
I think that finger pointing and 3 coming back to you, it's so true.
And I think, like, the other piece of this, right, it is again like bringing the magnifying glass back to myself. What can I do then? So how do I change this thing? So rather than saying, oh, those people are so bad for buying that, or these people are so bad for buying this, like, what do I buy and how do I do that responsibly? And I think, like, a really useful piece of information that came up really early in these conversations was that conversation about B Corps. Which to me, like, was
love B Corps.
That was a game changer.
Into B Corps.
Do you know why? Because I think that for me is one of the easiest ways to actively do something.
Yeah.
Like, all I have to do is Google B Corp and look at the list of who's on there and decide, okay, if I'm buying a coat for winter, and also, like, there are certain items of clothing that I buy with the knowledge that those things are going to last for 2, 3, 4 years, right? So, like, if I'm buying a jacket and my option is between one corporation that is doing things sustainably, and I know, like, the trucks that they're using are more likely to be electric, or they're very aware of, like, what the impact of their carbon, or what carbon footprint they're leaving on the planet when they're shipping products around the world, or whatever it might be. Like, that's a really easy way of cutting out the middleman and me not having to research every step of that process and that procedure, and just saying, right, I know that these people do the right thing, so therefore I can buy. And it doesn't have to be that I buy every single thing from there. And another part of this that was massive was, for me, was like Lola saying that it's not about buying more expensive pieces of clothing. It's actually about how long we use those items for, and not even so much about dismantling the fashion industry, but more about dismantling capitalism, and the necessity we have for buying new things and having new things. And, like, it was so interesting, man.
And you know, it, because I think all of this kind of brings us to something that we talked about a little bit, because episode 7 was with James Thornton, founder of Client Earth. Amazing dude, I'd say.
Wow. James is the person that's literally on the list of most important people for changing the world.
I know, and well deserved. So we talked a lot about the law in that episode, right? But there was something he said right at the beginning, and I wanted to highlight it because I think you'll agree, Ben. I think this is super important. So let's go to the audio tape. I've always wanted to say that.
Because what I wanted to do is to protect nature, you know, and then since law was in my family, I knew it was a powerful thing, and I thought, well, I'll become a lawyer and see what's possible, and then it became possible to use it very, very powerfully. But what I wanted to do is to protect nature, and I didn't originally want to protect people because I was quite pissed off at people because people were making all the problems, right? And it took years and years and years. But one day when I was in a Zen retreat, many years later, I felt I had this very strong experience where I realized that I had been thinking that people were going to kill all life on Earth. You know, that's why I was so angry. And I realized in this retreat that even if we did our worst. We're not going to take down all life on Earth. We could take ourselves down. We could take a lot of species down, but life would go on. And that doesn't seem like like an enormously powerful revelation when I put it that way, but it was for me. And I relaxed and I said, "Oh, wonderful! We can't kill all of life on Earth." And I started thinking, so what's my job then? What do I do? And the answer was, if people are causing the problems, I need to work with people. Oh, and if people are causing the problems, it's because they don't know what they're doing. So I found myself suddenly getting extremely fond of people, which was a big change. I'd been very angry, and then I started thinking, oh, okay, I need to take care of people and not just nature. And the next bit was, environmental problems are all mental problems. Because it's how we think about things. And how we think about things is what we then do, right? So environmental problems are mental problems. And I realized if I want to save nature, I have to work with people.
Can I tell you, Ben, that one of my favorite things of listening to all of our episodes is your reactions to everyone?
I'm like, yeah.
I love it. I think it's so great. But I love what James says here.
Yeah.
People.
Like so incredibly important. And the first, like so many parts of it, but the first part is like this idea. The thing that really stood out to me is this idea that people can't kill all life on Earth. Like we can kill ourselves, we can wipe humans off the face of the planet and take out a bunch of other species while we're doing it, but the planet will continue. Like like life on the planet will continue to survive. So actually, the approach to this becomes people-centric, right? Obviously, we're trying to save the planet, but the planet's going to survive. So really, like we can't afford to dismiss people, particularly when we now have all of these other layers to the conversation, especially the layer of intersectionality that helps us to understand who is most affected by this stuff and who is least likely to understand or engage in it, and then what the responsibility then is to engage those people and how we are able to do that. Like I think that's an amazing shift in like my ways of thinking about this conversation that's come up for me.
I don't think this is going to be a popular thing to say, but I think that the reason we have been so down on people is a legacy of colonialism. Yeah. I think
very unpopular, but very true.
It's the same. It's some of the same issues, like you said. We've had international development work and social justice work, but when we look at really, and I'm not going to say who. Anyone who knows me knows what I'm talking about, but I'm not going to say who. If we look at really famous environmentalists and conservationists, they have literally said things like humans are a plague on this earth. Yeah. And that we need to reduce the population and we need to do this and we need to do that. And when we hear those things, I really want people to be critical, because what we're saying here is that we are okay with a whole bunch of human beings dying. That's the long and short of it, right? When we don't care about people when it comes to environment and we say we're letting people die, that is, I think, inherently a white supremacist statement, because it is never white people we're talking about. It is always expendable black and brown people. It is always women, who are working in fisheries in East Africa. We're talking about, we are never talking about white people. We're never talking about Western people. And that's why people are so important. That's why keeping this human focus is so important.
And it's like, and you were saying it earlier, right? Like it's like this idea of Thanos in the Avengers, and the snap, right? And that being the great equalizer. And if we just wipe out half of the people on the planet, it'll be. But which half are we talking about? And I think that's the point that you're making, right? Is like these things are never. It's not randomized in the way that it's randomized in a comic book. Like this, like there is a system or a series of systems that are so interlinked that mean that there are particular people over and over again who are impacted, and some people who over and over again are not impacted by these things at all.
I used to think that climate change was the great equalizer, that we all cared about it. because it would impact all of us. And I've come to realize this year, because of what I've learned from watching this global pandemic with all of the rest of the world, is that it isn't the great equalizer. In fact, climate change will, like everything else, have a disproportionate impact on the people who are already suffering from the systems of oppression and probably had the least to do with creating it.
Yeah.
It's why you need to keep people center to the argument, I think.
Yeah, it always just perpetuates the inequalities, right? Rather than equalizing anything.
Exactly,
it just makes everything more stark, yeah.
Okay, well, we've gone to a pretty dark place. I think if you ever get to that, is it Thanos and the Avengers, you've gone to a dark place, and I think our speakers did a pretty good job of keeping us out of the darkness.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question.
Uh-huh.
What was the most shocking thing that you learned in this season?
Oh, most shocking thing that I learned was probably that my gas stove is killing me and my family. That was a pretty rough moment. I'm sure if you play the clip back, you'll hear me being like, "What? No way!" Like I was pretty deeply rattled by that.
Let's have a listen. Let's see if that's true. Let's have a listen.
Someone said to me, the biggest piece of your carbon footprint are the 4 gas appliances in your home. I said, what are you talking about? They're like, your water heater, your furnace, your dryer, and your stove.
Not the dryer. No way. Are you telling the truth?
4 gas appliances. It was a bigger carbon footprint than my car when I used to have a oil-fired car, gasoline car, petrol car. And I had never heard the story. And I was like, it can't be true. It just can't be true. So I did my research and I was like, oh yeah. As we've been making progress on all these other sectors, there's this thing literally under our feet or in our basement or in the closet that is emitting enormous amounts of pollution. So that was the first big revelation. But the second that really knocked my socks off was when someone said, 3 of those devices are required to be vented outside. All the pollution from heating water, drying your clothes, and heating your space, the pollution when they burn that gas has to be vented through a chimney outside. 1 doesn't. And then I was like, the stove? And they're like, yes, you're burning a fossil fuel inside a building, inside your home, inside your kitchen, one of the most sacred of all places. And no one told us that when we're cooking, whether it's boiling water for pasta or a holiday dinner, that we're emitting large amounts of pollution inside our homes. And we're still, the levels of pollution that we've known about for almost 3 decades are above levels that would be illegal outdoors in our homes. So that has been a big revelation.
Nah, man. That was bad. That was bad. I had a proper crisis after that. I was like, how do I get rid of this stove? This is terrible.
I think I got the most number of messages after this episode where people were like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. It's scary.
It is scary. It's scary. I'll tell you what it makes me think, or what I've been thinking about since that episode, that I find truly more scary is... So the thing about gas is, we've all gone around thinking, if it was bad for us, someone would tell us, right? No one has, until now. And I keep thinking, well, what else is there out there that is this bad, that no one is telling us about, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I found some pretty shocking stuff about recycling plastic, which I think we'll have to save until season 2 because I don't think that we can take it right now. But I do think that the episode with Bruce was the one that people found across the board most difficult. I have to ask this. I've been dying to ask this question. Have you talked to your parents about your gas stove?
No, I can't do it. I just ventilate the house while they're cooking. and while I'm cooking.
Have they wondered why you now go around obsessively opening windows?
Yeah, and my mum keeps switching off the fan. She hates it. She keeps switching off the extractor because it makes so much noise. But I'm like, no, you have to leave it on because it's. And I do you know what? I think I wanna with my parents. I thought about this a lot actually, and I wanna be in a position where I'm able to say to them, I will replace it.
Yeah.
Rather than just bugging them out. Do you know what I mean? Because also they're old. But,
yeah, I understand.
But yeah, I think that has been one of the most practical changes that I've made.
So let's go into the closing. Let's do a rapid fire closing, Ben.
Okay.
Here
we go.
Rapid fire closing. We ask all of our guests the following 2 questions. I would like the 2 of us to answer it now. So question 1, in under a minute, if everything goes right, if all these amazing people do, their work is successful, we support them, we fund them, all of it happens, what does 2030 look like?
So I think of my answer to this question in terms of cities, because that's where I live. I think the cities will sound quieter. There will hopefully be more electric cars and less cars on the roads. Like I remember that from the episode with Monica. I think also like an interesting thing that came up for me was this idea of why or where this work is being done and where those of us who are doing this work are situated. And I think it will look like the hubs of this work that need to be done being done from the communities that are most impacted by it. And the colour of climate action looking very different, I think is a massive thing. I think that has to change, right? Like those of us who are from the communities that are like mostly or most disproportionately affected by these issues have to begin to speak more about these things and start to do those different pieces of work. And I think it will look like also so much more creativity in what the work in inverted commas looks like. Like I think it will look like people making cartoons and comic books about climate change and people creating more art around the topic that's not just explicitly saying climate change is an issue. Education changing hopefully and kids learning more about these topics, but also learning how they can deal with that eco-anxiety and how they can act on what's happening. Those are the things that stand out for me. I'm not sure what does it look like for you, 2030?
I think it's 3 things for me. 1, that climate change is no longer like a partisan issue, where, if you're Democrat or you're Labour, you support it, and if you're Republican and Conservative, you don't. That we realise that climate change has nothing to do with like capital P politics, everything to do with lowercase p politics, but that, we all need to act on it and policymakers understand that, and so do people voting. The second is that as individuals, as consumers, as just people existing in the world, that it's easier for us to make good decisions because those decisions are more transparent, but also there's the cost of renewable energy has come down so much, and the cost of electric cars and fashion brands are being more transparent, and people care about each other around the world. And the third thing is that we are solidly, in the middle of a just transition. That we care about workers, we care about the lowest paid as well as the big kind of flashy stuff, and we are finding a way to justly transition out of these extractive and harmful economies, and we're doing it in a way that it supports workers, retrains them, and hopefully creates better livelihoods while holding on to some of the cultural elements that are tied up in these industries. So that's what I want 2030 to look like.
Okay, that's a good answer. That was such a good answer. Damn. Okay, the other question we always ask, right, is what, for the average person listening to this podcast, what can they do? And what does action, having heard 8 people answer this question and also thinking about our own answers, what does action look like to you, and what would you say to somebody who was asking you that question?
The simplest thing, and I've always said this, is vote. That's it for me. Is if find a couple of things you care about. You know, for me, it's like climate, it's women's rights, it's LGBT rights, it's the rights of migrants, it's refugee rights. I mean, this is not a few, and it's, you know, and the rights of sex workers. And I would look at those issues, and I look at the people who I'm voting for, and I vote for the person who matches that most. I know that sounds like a lot of work, but actually there's so many resources out there that can make it easier for you to vote. Voting is our most powerful tool that every citizen has, and that having lived in countries where I haven't been a citizen, and I've had to live under laws that I had no say and would never have a say in making. Yeah, it's so important we vote. So that's for me what it is.
That's such a good one again. And that's so interesting, the way that you phrase that, like having lived in countries where you have no say in what happens, be in somewhere where you can influence that or impact that.
Makes
it
such a
becomes
difference.
super important, right?
Yeah. We take it for granted. We take voting for granted.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, I have been, or my belief in the power of conversation has been reignited. And I think I am starting to understand the potential of what can happen when you do have conversations. So for me, I would say, like, by far the easiest place to start, and for anybody who's like me and listening and needs an easy place to start, I would say is listen to all of these episodes of the podcast and then have conversations with them about the people in your circles. Do you know what I mean? Like, or have conversations about them with the people in your circles, and also like share the podcast, like not because we want people to listen to them, but just because it's a really easy way of starting that conversation. And it doesn't have to be like, I think I've definitely learned over this process that you don't have to be an asshole to do it. Do you know what I mean? Like, you don't. Yeah. I think I had a perception of people who did this kind of work based on what the media has portrayed about more prominent voices in the conversation, which a lot of that portrayal is nonsense, and I know that it's nonsense, but that still seeps into your consciousness or your psyche. And I think I've discovered that you can be nice and you can be kind and you can be gentle and patient and have these conversations with people, and people can learn, and I have learned. And that becomes super important. So I would say, like, conversation becomes super, super important.
Can I have a cheeky second one,
Of
which
course.
is not really mine, but it's Chris Demers, but I think it was probably, for me, one of the most important. I don't even know if it was part of his answer to this question, but it came out in his episode, which was, think about what you do. I mean, I know Clover talks about this. Think about what you do. Think about your skills. Think about your world. And then think about climate as you start to learn about it, and look at the two. Look at climate through the lens of your world, and that will help you understand how you can best contribute to this. Maybe we don't all best contribute to it by all just taking a series of checklist actions. Maybe we do it, Ben, by you being a podcast host, and by me curating voices, and and also making other good decisions. But I think this idea of, like, find your place in it is so powerful.
Yeah. So important.
Okay.
And so freeing.
And so freeing. So freeing if you realize you don't all have to do the same thing.
Yeah.
You know what time it is now?
It's time for reverse confessions.
So what are reverse climate confessions, you may ask? So I thought after 16 confessions from the two of us.
After discovering that we are horrible people,
we should possibly maybe. I was actually just really curious to know if you had changed anything from having confessed to your crimes.
Well, the answer is no. I have changed some stuff. I've said a lot of it already. So the stuff around...
tell me the top things.
So definitely, like, my water usage. I don't brush my teeth using hot or warm water anymore. Although it's very uncomfortable and it's not my favourite thing in the world, I don't do that. I always ventilate when I'm cooking in the kitchen
Yeah.
now. Although I'm sure that that's equally as bad because I'm just putting it outside. But at least I'm not directly impacting my parents in that way.
Yeah.
And I think I can't think of any others now. I'm under pressure. I am looking into sustainably sourcing new underwear. Because I need to. That's a big one for me. The H&M thing was a massive one for me, and I need to really seriously think about that. So I'm actually researching it.
I'm really looking forward to you. I want you to come back for season 2 with an answer for our people who are now not going to have underwear for 3 months.
Got you. Don't worry about it. What have you been doing?
Okay, two for me. One is I got a lovely coffee maker. In my house, which means I no longer have to go out and get coffee with disposable cups.
Smart.
Because I just cannot. Like, if you think about it, this year alone, which is when my coffee addiction has kicked in, I'll probably have thrown away like 600 disposable cups.
Wow.
That's just not on, is it?
Imagine.
Right?
Yeah.
So I have a coffee maker at home. I love it. So that's been a big one. And the other one, which is again like a bit more, I guess, not again, but is something that I only confessed to last week, but I think I've been thinking about it for a long time, and so I've been trying to change my behaviour, is I'm trying to not stop buying things just to make myself feel better. And yeah, just see if I can realise, like, decouple that thinking, because the truth is that I never do actually feel better.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't
It's not
work,
even
does
working.
It?
So yeah, those are my two. Okay, Ben. I started this whole crazy journey with you 9 episodes ago, I guess now, asking you one question, and I want to ask it to you again as we close this bonus episode of season 1. Ready?
Yeah.
Do you care about climate change?
Oh yeah, 100%. Like I just, and now at this point I feel like, how can you not? And also, like, even if I didn't explicitly care about climate change is so intertwined into all of the other things that I care about that I obviously do. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's so linked, and so urgent.
Yeah.
And also manageable.
Wow.
Which is a big thing. I think a big learning for me in this process.
Yeah. Love it.
Good job.
2 things I want to say in closing. One of them is that we know that you're going to miss us.
Yeah.
Dearly. Deeply. We're going to miss all of you. So if you do miss us, don't miss us too badly, because you can hear from Clover and you can hear from Ben and 12 other amazing speakers at TEDxLondon Women on the 6th of February. Tickets are still available. You'll see them linked all over our social media. We'd love to have you. It's a COVID-safe event. You'll be watching it from home. And Ben, it's going to be pretty epic, isn't it?
It's going to be so good. It's
good.
going to be great. It's going to be great. Yeah.
And I guess the last thing to say, well, I guess this is really my last question, Ben, is will you come back and do season 2 with me?
Oh, of course. Maryam, you don't need to ask me questions like that. That's ridiculous. Of course I will. What else am I going to do? This is like the best part of my week. This is so fun. Yeah, of course I will.
So I guess we'll catch you in season 2, which will be coming in spring 2021.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And...
So, yes.
Do I get to say it now?
Yeah, please.
Okay. And remember, stay curious. Thanks for joining us this week. If you enjoyed what you listened to today, please rate and subscribe and share the episode with a curious friend. Join the conversation on socials using the hashtag ClimateCuriousPod and let us know what you want to hear about next time. You can find us online at TEDxLondon.
This podcast was made possible by TEDxLondon's headline partner, City. City is all about progress and supporting great ideas. And for the past 5 years, they've supported us to bring world-changing ideas to the TEDxLondon stage. Now they're taking it to the next level by supporting this new podcast. Thanks, City. This episode was produced by Josie Coulter, curation and research by Tara Cooper, engineered and mixed by Ben Beheshti. Artwork designed by Sabrina Russo and Rebecca Mingus. Music composed by Ben the Falcon Beheshti. Presented by Maryam Pasha and Ben Hurst.